Can you guess what the most valuable illegal trade is? Of course, you're right. It's the drug trade. Except it's not. The largest illicit trade is actually counterfeiting at around $1.1 trillion. Duh, I mean there's a ton of knockoffs out there and the prices you can get on a fake Louis bag, they're pretty high. Then the second largest illegal trade is drugs at $600 billion. As long as there's a demand, there will be groups willing to transport them. But get to number 3 on the list and you have the black market sand trade. Yes, you heard that right. The black market sand trade sitting at around $300 billion. These tiny grains are behind one of the biggest mafia rings on earth, bypassing lawmakers, paying off regulators, and even killing opponents of them. Let's take a glimpse into the world of sand mining, the opposition to it, and the reasons why this sand-led destruction is only likely to grow. And I promise by the end of this video, you will see this innocent material in a completely new way. First, there has to be some reason we mine 50 billion tons of sand a year, right? That's because sand is a beyond useful material, probably in the big 3 essential materials, up there with water and oil. Sand is technically defined as any solid grain measuring between 0.0625 and 2 millimeters long, but the stuff we look for most of the time are sands made of silica, essentially ground up quartz. Sand can vary in its composition, size, and shape with thousands of different kinds on Earth. The purest ones, those around 90% silica and up, can be melted down into things like glass, solar panels, microchips, or mixed with water and used for fracking. Because these specific uses need such specific sands, they often come from only a handful of sources. Fontainebleau has supplied much of Europe's glass-making industry since, well, glass was fashionable. In North Carolina, there's a town whose sand is nearly the only source to make the ultra-pure silicon crucibles required to melt down the polysilicon which makes semiconductors and solar cells. And again, it's just the luck of the US that it has in Wisconsin a perfect deposit of fracking sand. The right hardness, size, and shape. Just one state over from North Dakota's shale fields. They just have everything, huh? But actually move down the purity scale and the usefulness of the sand explodes. This sand might not be able to make a microwave, but it can make a building. Okay. That's because this quality of sand is one of the key ingredients in concrete. This construction sand can be found almost anywhere, and with some ratio of sand, gravel, crushed up limestone, and water, you can make a cheap, pourable, moldable rock which, along with steel rebar, is the choice for building anything, anywhere. Apartments, stadiums, dams, bridges, roads, even boats have been made of concrete. Almost 80% of our construction materials are made of some type of aggregate, a mix of sand and gravel, and it takes a lot of the stuff. Around 200 tons for a typical house, 30,000 for a kilometer of highway, 5.5 million for a Hoover Dam, or 300 million tons to make one New York City. So, in total, there are around 80 tons of concrete for every person on Earth. The amount of hospitals, schools, roads, ports, you name it, that have been built with concrete has had an immeasurable impact on all of our lives. But we don't just use any sand. Look at this satellite map. Almost all of this is unusable. Desert sand, shaped by the wind, is too fine and uniform in size to lock into shape when hardened. Instead, what's cheapest is sand eroded by water, either from the coast or from a river. This way, the varied sizes of the sand will lock together and in a chemical reaction with cement and water, grow into stony crystals when cured. Sure, you could make sand, but that's a very expensive option when cheap sand lies almost everywhere. And sure, you could also dredge sand from the sea, where an unfathomable amount lies, but without proper treatment, the salt makes a very weak type of concrete. For example, both Haitian and Turkish developers have used marine sands in their coastal construction. Earthquakes in these regions have shown how strong this type of sand is when tested. Go even further down the purity scale, and while this stuff is still useful, it just can't compare to the amount of lives changed by concrete. This is the stuff that's mostly used for land reclamation, the second largest use of sand, which could be for beach nourishment or land creation. Coastal cities which have run out of space often expand using sea sand. For example, Tokyo has added 250 square kilometers to itself this way. The Maldives is creating brand new islands. Singapore has grown by a quarter since the 60s, and China is adding a new Singapore every year through land reclamation. Dubai is a fun case because while the Palm Jumeirah and World Islands were made using dredged up sea sand, they don't have enough of the high silica sand needed for making concrete or glass, the stuff that pretty much is their city. So while they sit in the middle of a desert, the Emiratis import sand from Australia to fund their lifestyle. There's only one statistic that is driving sand use to all-time highs. It's not Moore's Law and the sand required for that. It's not the demand for chips which will power AI. It's the fact that every year around 60 million people move into cities. Of those who do, about 25% now live in cities over 1 million people. That's 60 million people who need to move around, work in offices, and most importantly, live in concrete-built buildings. Infrastructure demand makes up the bulk of sand demand. Along with the fact that sand is rather heavy and cheap, most sand is mined close to where it ends up in the concrete mixer. That generally ends up being a river near the construction site, an average of 40 kilometers away. And it's quite rare you find real cases of international trade in sand. The largest exporter is India, but they only export 8% of their production, while the largest importers of sand include 5 microstates. Andorra is on that list, and Andorra should not be a top importer of anything, let alone for such an important resource. However, this mostly reflects the fact that sand flows in one general path, from shores to cities. And if trends continue, we may use up to 80 billion tons a year by 2060. We're already sitting at somewhere like an $800 billion sand mining industry, so it could very well hit over $1 trillion in the next few decades. Since it's such a local activity, extraction tracks wherever there are construction booms. For example, when the US had a real estate craze in the early 2000s, its sand demand rose until the crash in 2007, where it hasn't recovered since. Spain and Italy have seen similar booms and busts in sand mining. So right now, it's areas like Asia, Africa, and Latin America, those whose populations are rapidly urbanizing, where sand mining is in the highest demand. You know, I say these 3 continents, but really I should be saying China and everyone else. China uses more concrete than the rest of the world combined. Although growing countries like India have quadrupled their extraction in the last 2 decades, China's 3-decade-long investment splurge grew rapidly until sand mining peaked in 2014, totaling 7.5 billion tons dug up in a single year, which made up about 2/3 of the world's extraction in that year. To give you perspective on that insane number, America laid around 900 million tons of concrete throughout the 2010s. China laid over 25 billion tons in the same period. Sand is unlike any other extraction. Generally, mining is an incredibly capital-intensive process, which requires high-skilled workers to prospect for and design the mines needed to access the mineral. But sand is nearly everywhere, and nearly everyone can dig it up. The entry barrier is just a shovel and a truck. So unlike mining, whose high costs and exclusionary practices naturally form monopolies selling at a global price, sand mining is dominated by small operators who sell for local prices. This can range from concrete companies who operate small mines across the globe to local farmers who might steal sand from a beach for better crop yields. The US alone has over 4,000 sand mining companies versus like 4 significant mining companies. And globally, it's estimated that there are around 100 to 150 million artisan sand miners. Lake Poyang, considered the largest single sand mine on Earth near some of China's largest urban centers, has, from just small operators, lost almost 230 million cubic meters of sand. Wherever there's a building boom, miners will appear, even if they're not officially counted as a miner. So if sand were to be counted as a mineral, by weight, we would mine more of it every year than every single other mineral on Earth 5 times over. And it's because of this market structure, tons of individual operators vying for the same sand wherever construction takes place, that makes sand extraction such a destructive industry. Sand naturally replenishes itself as mountains and rocks erode, depositing grains downstream. The further down a river, the faster the stream and the finer the sand. However, we mine at around 25 times the natural replenishment rate, and as miners target that sweet spot in the middle, it reduces the granularity of the sand, coarsening the sediments in the water. This gravelifying of river systems can reduce the filtering effect of their sand, increasing heavy metal concentrations in the water, effectively poisoning it. It can also increase the salinity of the water, harming drinking and farming supplies. Some microorganisms which need a layer of sand to survive on can die off, disrupting the balance of the ecosystem, or riverbanks can erode to the point of failure, widening the river and increasing its flow. If there's a common trend around sand mining regions, it's the increase of floods in the surrounding areas. For example, riverbeds in the Indian state of Kerala have been lowered by 6 feet as the miners extract at 40 times the replenishment rate. This has led to floods in the region that have destroyed thousands of homes and killed over 600 people. In Lake Poyang, sand extraction has eroded shores so drastically in 2 decades that the change is clearly visible from space. In fact, the Yangtze River, which flows out of the lake, has nearly doubled its flow as the river has widened. Or take the Mekong, whose flow runs through 6 countries. Every year, 55 million tons of sand are removed from it. You can even go online and order some Mekong sand yourself if you're ever in a construction type of mood. As the sand is removed, the delta near Ho Chi Minh City is literally sinking as the flow becomes too much for the earth to handle. By 2100, half of the delta could be underwater from removing the river's natural defenses. This is a river that feeds 60 million people. Rising salinity and increased floods won't just affect drinking supplies, but how many crops they can grow, hurting everyone in the region and further. In the US, sandbank erosion has weakened natural hurricane defenses, making flooding worse, particularly in urban areas near heavily mined rivers like Houston. Beach mining can even sink entire islands. Since 2005, about 24 Indonesian islands have disappeared, their coasts ending up inside of neighboring Singapore. In fact, because Singapore has demanded so much sand to fuel its growth, Malaysia outright banned sand exports to the city-state. Then Indonesia followed, Vietnam banned it soon after, and after being the main supplier of Singapore's recent growth, Cambodia finally banned its sand exports in 2017. This only banned the legal sand trade though, which didn't have much of an effect. At the time of its ban, only 4% of Cambodian sand shipped to Singapore was actually documented. Miners who think they can make a quick buck digging up the beaches of small Indonesian islands have continued operations as normal. And since its damaging effects aren't just found in Southeast Asia, sand extraction is a highly restrictive industry worldwide. from limiting large-scale operations to outright bans on mining in certain regions. The local nature of the industry and the money involved also pressures richer miners to set up deals with local authorities to allow extraction, getting them involved in the transport in some way. This trade is just not consolidated enough to keep an eye on, fueling that $300 billion black market. Sand, if mined enough, is considered illegal almost anywhere it comes from. But buildings still need to be built, and so some find ways to keep that supply chain running. Though, with these groups comes violence, harassment, and death. Despite frequent bans, sand mining really is a lawless industry. Across the world, there are gangs who've made quite a profit stealing beach sand while no one's looking. Authorities who have tried to quell it have been threatened, paid off, or killed. For instance, in Morocco, it's estimated over half of mined sand is illegally sourced by these cartoonish gangs, with officials aiding the miners in transporting and marketing it. Protesters who have tried to come up to the beaches have been threatened and beaten. The same is true in places from Brazil to Ghana. Not only have around a dozen been killed from protesting sand mines, but miners have been found drowned or even burned alive in trucks found with illegal sand. India, which has been going through a rapid urbanization and dealing with the environmental impacts of sand mining, has banned it in its largest province, Uttar Pradesh. This has had exactly the effect you would expect: corruption, black markets, and fights over who can access the banned sand. India has by far the largest sand-affiliated gangs on Earth, with makeshift tent cities popping up next to their major rivers and assembly lines of backhoes and trucks dredging the sand to haul it to the city. The resulting protests and police crackdowns have led to hundreds of deaths in the country. But it's hard to change anything when everyone involved is benefiting, from the sand mining goon to the local police officer. There's no one sand mafia, but collectively they make up one of the most environmentally destructive forces on Earth, and they're one of the hardest to catch as well. Here, let me give you a tip if you ever want to join one of these sand gangs. If you have a pile of illegally sourced sand and a pile of legally sourced sand, mix them and officials can't tell the difference. See, the money to be made is just too easy. There are innovations like recycled sand through rocks, bricks, or glass which may help, but mined sand will always have the cost advantage. Or we could recycle our crumbling infrastructure out of one building and into the next. Or, crazy idea, sand in practice acts as a renewable resource. As long as more sand is flowing into the river than out, mining won't have much of an environmental impact. Just don't overmine one area, gangs. Still, there's not much to be hopeful about when it comes to eliminating these groups. Sand demand is expected to rise by almost 50% in the next 4 decades as cities grow and we replace the now crumbling concrete laid in the 1900s. That's predicted to raise sand's average price by almost 2 times. So a prospective mining gang can expect twice the profit. Not a bad time to enter the market. If we keep mining at the rate we are now, who knows? Maybe one day sand smuggling can finally beat drug trafficking.